2013 Convocation Interview Series. My name is Julianna Warner. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Rash. Rash is a poet, novelist, and short story writer. He graduated from Gardner-Webb University and Clemson University and is now the Paris Distinguished Professor in Appalachian Cultural Studies at Western Carolina University. He is one of the most renowned Appalachian authors of our time. He has published 13 books in addition to earning many prestigious awards for his writing. Our interviewers today are Andrea and Duncan Blunt. Would you please introduce yourselves?
I'm Andrea and I'm a senior English writing major.
I'm Duncan Blunt, and I'm an English major as well, and I'm also a really big fan of Rash.
Duncan, would you begin with your first question?
I think it's interesting that your first book was published when you were 40 years old. How often did you write before you started your first book, and what was it like pursuing that first publication?
Well, I did publish late compared to a lot of writers, and I'd really been writing very seriously since my mid to late 20s. But I think in many ways it was good that I didn't publish before that. I think I was learning my craft, and the work wasn't as good as it should be to be published. So I have no regrets about coming to it later. But it was a long, slow process, publishing a lot in journals and magazines, and eventually finally finding somebody who would be interested in a book-length manuscript. But all that while, I didn't get discouraged. I just kept writing, and I think sometimes younger writers worry too much about getting published right away. Learn your craft, be patient, and I think you can look at how long it took me, and that should make you feel in some ways, well, yeah, maybe I'm 25 and I haven't published a book yet, but that's okay.
Right.
Your prose is mostly fiction, while much of it draws on historical research you've done. Where do you find inspiration for your poetry?
I find it where I find a lot of the inspiration for the fiction. I mean, so much of my work is about place, and even in the poetry that comes through. I think some of my influences are different for poetry. Writers such as James Dickey and Seamus Heaney have been very important. But James Steele certainly was a poet I've read. Robert Morgan and Fred Chappell have been very important to me as poets from the region. But I continue to use stories I've heard growing up, stories in my family, and aspects of the culture that I find fascinating.
In Serena, I noticed echoes of a Southern Gothic style of writing. Do you take something from or identify with that genre?
I've been called a Gothic writer, Southern Gothic writer, and I'm always sometimes a little leery of labels just because there's the implication that you might be just a Gothic writer or just this or just that. But I do feel that in some ways I am part of that tradition. Writers such as Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner have certainly had an impact on me, and I think that kind of story that we think of as Southern Gothic is something that's hugely influenced me, particularly when I was young, even going back to Poe.
When I read One Foot in Eden, and then later read excerpts from Nothing Gold Can Stay, I noticed how you often give characters deep, mysterious pasts. How do you plan and map out the complexity of your characters while writing?
I think a lot of times what happens as far as the complexity of the characters is that through the drafts and through my, in a sense, spending time with them, they start to reveal themselves, and I start to see depths, and sometimes surprising depths that I had not anticipated. I think, for instance, in One Foot in Eden, the sheriff in the early drafts was a very secondary character. He didn't even have a voice in that novel, and yet I started to realize that his story was as interesting as Billy's and Amy's, and so I think it's a process of discovering the characters, and it's kind of like in real life. I mean, the more you're around somebody, the more you have a sense of who that person is.
You mentioned in an earlier discussion that regional writing is different from local color writing. Do you feel that in order to be a true regional writer, you have to have lived in that region for all or most of your life? And what advice do you have for someone who wants to avoid local color writing and write regionally but isn't from that region? Okay.
Well, I think that I do believe that you can write about a place authentically, or whatever word you want to use. I think the great example for me is of somebody who's really written and really understands the culture is Annie Proulx. In her career, she's written about the northeastern United States. She's written about parts of Canada, and she's also now, in the last 20 years, writing primarily about Wyoming. And she moved to those places, but I think she loved those places. I think part of it's just loving the place or embedding yourself deeply enough into the place. So I don't feel necessarily for someone, say, to write about Appalachia that person could not come from somewhere else. I think it's a matter of really trying to understand the place and grounding yourself in the place. The second part of your question was?
What advice would you have
Yeah.
for someone who...
Yeah, I think what you want to do, Muriel Spark, a writer, an English novelist, said the role of the artist is to deepen the mystery. And I think what regional writing very often does is even though it may be using dialect and what could be potentially cliched situations, say we're talking about Appalachian writing, but the writer refuses to go with those simplifications, and that ultimately the writing, there's a depth beneath it or above it, within it, that opens up the characters and makes them, the characters, the situations, much more complex than the reader might initially suppose. I mean, one thing I tried to do in my third novel, The World Made Straight, I started off deliberately writing these characters as if they would be, in a sense, as cliched characters. And I let the reader have that assumption. And then through the next 300 pages, I deconstructed would be the term a lot of people would use today, and showed that what they thought these characters, who they thought they were, it was just, in a way, almost a kind of prejudice of the reader,
You've said before that short stories are closer to poems than they are to novels because in a short story, every word counts. What are some short stories that you've read that you think take advantage of their short length to make every word count?
I think probably the great example is Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man's Hard to Find. And that story just strikes me as being as perfect as any story I've ever read. And what I mean by perfect is that every sentence is in its right place and every sentence is necessary to the story. But there's certainly other stories that I think do this very well. A story that I love very much is Araby by James Joyce. That's a really tight story, I think, that does a good job. There's some stories by Alice Munro that I think are pretty close to perfect. So yeah, Chekhov. I wish I cannot read Russian. I wish I could. I think I would appreciate him even more. But I think when you read Chekhov, you sense that everything is working toward the total effect of the story.
When I read 3 a.m. and the stars were out and Nothing Gold Can Stay, I was so impressed with how intimate I became with Carson. Was Carson's character inspired by someone in your life?
Not really. I mean, I've always admired veterinarians, but I think one of the great, aspects of art is that, and writing, that enjoyment of it is that you try to imagine the world as someone very different from you might imagine it, and you hope that Carson comes off convincing for someone of his age and his occupation and those things. So certainly I admire veterinarians, and I think that probably played a role in it, particularly large animal vets. And I've known some men in the sense like Carson who, and his friend Darnell, men who very often, like men of that generation, talked around things. They didn't really talk a lot, but everything they said meant so much on so many levels. And I hope I captured some of that in that story.
Yeah. And how do you learn about and come up with all the dazzling details of unfamiliar scenes, such as when Carson was birthing that calf in the barn?
I actually went to I have a friend who's a large animal vet, and I actually had him essentially teach me how to birth a calf.
Cool.
And I actually tried on the shoulder glove. Just really got to know the equipment, what he would use, how he would use it. And what's been interesting about that story is that I've read it several times to audiences, and I didn't know it at the time, but there were veterinarians, and every one of them said I got it right. And I said, well, you're giving me too much credit. My veterinarian is the one who gave me these details. So I think, that's one thing that you do. Research is very valuable because it helps you to get a sense of how something's done. And one thing I've learned is that people love to read fiction because they love to read fiction to realize about true things. You know, even something like, you know, how would somebody birth a calf in this situation?
You've stressed the importance of not striving for perfection in the very first draft, and that revision is a crucial step of the writing process. When making tough decisions, do you feel like you sometimes lose pieces of the story that you didn't want to part with?
There's always a risk. I mean, I think sometimes there is a risk of you know, I mean, when do you stop editing? Because one thing that I find interesting, even today when I was reading One Foot in Eden, I skipped over a word because I realized I don't need that word in this scene, and that, you know, it's after 15 drafts. So, yeah, I think sometimes you hope that that editorial part of you is on, but I think ultimately, you know, there've been times when I've taken things out and I put them back in, and that happens a lot. You know, I'll think, well, I don't need this, and then I'll realize maybe a few pages later, yeah, I do. So I think sometimes it's just a process of, you know, taking things out, putting them back in, maybe putting them in a different place, and but sometimes I think Henry James said this first, that you have to kill your darlings, and that very often it might be the best sentence in the whole story, but if it doesn't work for the story, you have to be able to cut that out and without regret.
When I graduate, my degree will be in writing. Sometimes I get so busy with school that I realize I haven't done any non-academic writing for weeks or sometimes months. When you find yourself caught up in other things, how do you get refocused on your writing?
Well, I think that's always one of the difficulties, and I do think it's very important that even if you're not writing, that you save a little time during the day to think as a writer. I mean, you know, very often it's just daydreaming, but you need that. And what I found is that the easiest thing to do is find an excuse for not writing. But what I've done is that I make writing a part of my day. That somehow I'm going to find a part of my day. Now, I haven't done that today so far, but tonight I'll probably, at least for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I'll look over something. Yesterday when I got here, I wrote for 3 straight hours as soon as I got here. So, you know, I've learned to write in hotel rooms. I've learned to write on, you know, in airports. I mean, because if I don't, I'm not going to get anything done. So I think you just have to say this is important enough to where, you know, I'm not going out tonight. You know, I'm going. You know, I'm not going to watch Seinfeld. You know, I'm going to take, you know, spend some time. And I think sometimes when you really are busy, I think it's better to do it in the mornings, because by the time you get to the evening, you're so tired and burned out. And when I was teaching 5, sometimes 6 classes a semester, when I taught at a community college, I ended up teaching night classes and afternoon classes and late morning classes, so I could come in and I would have at least an hour or 2 where I was fresh, and then I would do my teaching, but I wasn't burned out. So you find ways.
Those are all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
It's been a pleasure.